Well, I guess, Burt, you haven't been nominated this year.
No, you haven't been either, Kirk. Congratulations.
Burt Lancaster utterly hated Kirk Douglas. Now we know the reason why, and the explosive truth still reverberates through Hollywood history, impacting a staggering 47 films across their careers. Imagine standing on a movie set as two of Hollywood's most powerful actors nearly come to blows. The crew frozen in place, a director desperately trying to separate them, two legends whose combined star power could illuminate an entire studio lot, yet whose private animosity could just as easily burn it to the ground. On camera, they played best friends, brothers, rivals, and enemies. But once the cameras stopped rolling, Lancaster and Douglas reportedly maintained one of the most complex and volatile relationships in Hollywood history. The year was 1957. The film was Gunfight at the OK Corral. Lancaster, playing the legendary lawman Wyatt Earp, allegedly stormed off set after Douglas, as the infamous Doc Holliday, refused to follow the director's blocking for the 18th time. "He thinks he's running the damn picture," Lancaster reportedly fumed to a producer. But this was merely the visible tip of a jealousy-soaked iceberg that had been forming for years. Was it artistic differences, professional rivalry, or something far more personal that kept these titans at each other's throats? Stay with me to uncover the jaw-dropping truth behind one of Hollywood's most fascinating feuds. Before we dive deeper, make sure you're subscribed for more untold Hollywood stories just like this one. Now let's rewind the clock. Who was Burt Lancaster? To understand the man who would develop such a burning animosity toward Kirk Douglas, we need to start at the very beginning. Burt and Stephen Lancaster entered the world on November 2, 1913, in East Harlem, New York City. Born into the kind of humble circumstances that would later fuel his fiery drive to succeed at all costs. The son of a postal worker, young Burt grew up on the tough streets of Manhattan, where he developed both the physical prowess and the unflinching gaze that would later captivate millions. His childhood was not one of privilege or connections, which perhaps explains the chip on his shoulder when dealing with those he perceived as having an easier path. Lancaster's athletic abilities were evident from an early age. Those who knew him as a boy reportedly remembered a fearless child who could scale fire escapes with the agility of a cat and who never backed down from confrontation. This physical confidence would serve him well in his unexpected first career. Can you picture a young Lancaster barely out of his teens, flying through the air as part of the famous K. Traherne circus act? It's hard to imagine the serious dramatic actor we came to know starting his performing career in sequins and tights, but Lancaster spent the better part of 5 years as a circus acrobat. This period allegedly ended abruptly when a hand injury forced him to reconsider his future, a pivotal moment that would eventually lead him to the silver screen. But before Hollywood came calling, history intervened. When World War II erupted, Lancaster enlisted in the United States Army in 1942. His time in uniform would fundamentally shape his worldview, and some close associates later claimed instill in him a rigidity about hierarchy and respect that would lead to numerous on-set conflicts throughout his career. Serving in the Army's Special Services Division, Lancaster allegedly entertained troops across North Africa and Italy. Unlike some stars who served in relative comfort, Lancaster reportedly experienced genuine hardship and danger during his military stint, creating another point of silent comparison he would later make with actors he felt had been sheltered from real-world struggles. After the war, like so many returning veterans, Lancaster found himself at a crossroads. What happened next reads like the kind of fictional lucky break that screenwriters love to invent, except it actually happened. In 1945, riding an elevator in New York City, Lancaster was spotted by a talent scout who was struck by his imposing physical presence and chiseled features. This chance encounter led to an audition for a Broadway play called A Sound of Hunting. Though the play ran for only 3 weeks, it was enough to catch Hollywood's attention. And here's where Lancaster's story takes its first truly extraordinary turn. Unlike most actors who spend years climbing the Hollywood ladder one rung at a time, Lancaster burst onto the scene with his very first film role. The movie was The Killers in 1946, a noir classic based on an Ernest Hemingway short story. Lancaster, with zero film experience, wasn't just given a supporting role, he was the male lead opposite Ava Gardner. Can you imagine the pressure, the audacity, the raw nerve it would take to step onto a major studio set with cameras rolling and deliver a performance that would establish you as an immediate star? But that's exactly what Lancaster did. Critics were stunned by his natural screen presence, that famous smile that could switch from charming to menacing in a heartbeat, and the coiled physical energy he brought to every scene. The Killers was a smash hit, and overnight Burt Lancaster, the circus performer turned soldier turned actor, became Burt Lancaster, Hollywood star. But here's what most people don't know. This meteoric rise allegedly planted the first seeds of his later resentment toward Kirk Douglas. Why? Because Lancaster had achieved something remarkable, instant stardom, and reportedly felt that his status as a self-made man who'd earned every break through grit and circumstance made him special. When Douglas would later follow a somewhat similar trajectory, Lancaster allegedly viewed it as a pale imitation of his own unique story. But we're getting ahead of ourselves. Throughout the late 1940s, Lancaster cemented his status as box office gold. Films like Brute Force in 1947, Sorry, Wrong Number in 1948, and Criss Cross in 1949 showcased not just his physical presence, but a surprising depth and vulnerability that expanded his range beyond tough guy roles. Then Lancaster made an unprecedented move that revealed his true character, and perhaps foreshadowed the control issues that would later fuel his feud with Douglas. In 1948, at the height of the studio system's power, when actors were treated as studio property, Lancaster formed his own production company, originally called Norma Productions and later Hecht Hill Lancaster. This was nothing short of revolutionary. At a time when stars did what they were told, Lancaster demanded creative control over his projects. The message was clear: no one, not executives, not directors, and certainly not other actors, would tell Burt Lancaster what to do. Does this sound like a man who would easily share the spotlight? Who would gracefully accommodate another strong personality? The evidence suggests otherwise. In his personal life, Lancaster was equally complex and sometimes contradictory. Married 3 times, he allegedly had a volatile temper behind closed doors that few outside his inner circle ever witnessed. A former assistant reportedly claimed that Lancaster could be charming and generous one moment, then erupt into a controlled fury the next if things weren't done exactly to his specifications. The 1950s saw Lancaster expand his range with films like From Here to Eternity in 1953, where his passionate beach scene with Deborah Kerr became one of cinema's most iconic moments. But even as he collected accolades, industry insiders reportedly whispered about his increasingly difficult behavior on set. Directors who crossed him often found themselves replaced. Co-stars who attempted to steal scenes allegedly received the full force of Lancaster's intimidating glare. And through it all, Lancaster watched the rise of other male stars with the hawkish intensity of a man who viewed Hollywood success as a zero-sum game. Every magazine cover another actor graced was one denied to him. Every role offered to someone else was a personal slight. At least, that's how some close to him during this period have characterized his mindset. Are you Team Lancaster or Team Douglas so far? Type it in the comments now, and let's see how you feel by the end of this story. The year 1957 marked a significant turning point. Lancaster won an Academy Award for his performance in Elmer Gantry, finally receiving the industry's highest recognition. You might think this would soften his competitive edge, but according to those who worked with him, the opposite occurred. The Oscar allegedly convinced Lancaster that he was not just a star, but an artist of the highest caliber, and his tolerance for those he considered less committed to the craft reportedly diminished even further. What many fans don't realize is that Lancaster was also deeply political in ways that put him at odds with Hollywood's establishment. While many stars remained silent during the McCarthy era and the blacklist, Lancaster was reportedly vocal in his opposition to what he saw as political persecution. He allegedly hired blacklisted writers through his production company, an act of both principle and defiance that showcased his willingness to buck the system. This political courage makes what happened later with Douglas all the more complicated and fascinating. Behind the glamorous facade, Lancaster nursed private wounds. A lifelong battle with what we would now recognize as anxiety reportedly plagued him. Close associates claimed he suffered from insomnia and would often call them in the middle of the night to discuss film projects or to vent about perceived slights from rivals. Lancaster's dedication to physical fitness remained legendary throughout his life. Well into his 50s, he reportedly performed his own stunts and maintained a grueling exercise regimen that would exhaust men half his age. This physical discipline extended to his professional preparation. Lancaster was known to be meticulously prepared, often memorizing not just his lines but the entire script before filming began. Can you imagine the frustration such a precisely calibrated performer might feel when working with someone who approached acting more intuitively? Someone who might change dialogue on the fly or improvise movements? Someone like Kirk Douglas? As the 1960s dawned, Lancaster's career showed no signs of slowing down. He continued to alternate between commercial projects and more artistic ventures, always maintaining creative control through his production company. But beneath the surface, something was shifting in Hollywood. The old studio system was crumbling. New stars were emerging, and the intense, controlled acting style that Lancaster had pioneered was gradually giving way to a more naturalistic approach. For a man who had built his identity around being at the forefront of his profession, these changes were reportedly difficult to accept. And as his contemporary and sometime collaborator Kirk Douglas continued to thrive and evolve with the changing times, Lancaster's private resentment allegedly festered. Friends from this period have claimed that Lancaster kept a mental scorecard of his accomplishments versus those of Douglas. Box office numbers, critical reviews, magazine covers, all were supposedly tallied in an ongoing competition that existed primarily in Lancaster's mind. Here's something few people know. According to a makeup artist who worked with both men, Lancaster allegedly had a peculiar habit of collecting magazines that featured Douglas and storing them in a drawer in his dressing room, not to read or admire, but supposedly to keep track of his rival's public image. If true, this suggests an obsession that went beyond normal professional competition. By the late 1960s, Lancaster's personal life was increasingly complicated. His marriage to his second wife, Norma Anderson, ended in 1969 after 23 years. Around the same time, his production company faced financial difficulties. As both his private and professional foundations shook, Lancaster reportedly became even more sensitive to comparisons with Douglas, who seemed, at least from the outside, to be enjoying greater stability. But Hollywood creates mirages. The public personas rarely match the private realities, and the truth about both men, and the animosity between them, was far more nuanced than fan magazines of the era could possibly capture. If you blink, you'll miss the fact that Alfred Hitchcock once approached both Lancaster and Douglas for the same film, Strangers on a Train, before casting neither of them, believing their rivalry would overshadow his picture. Comment below if you caught this bit of trivia. Lancaster's career entered yet another phase in the 1970s as he took on more character-driven roles that showcased his range beyond the action heroes and swashbucklers of his earlier years. Films like Atlantic City in 1980 earned him another Oscar nomination and the respect of a new generation of filmmakers and critics. All the while, the Lancaster-Douglas dynamic reportedly simmered just below boiling point, visible to industry insiders but largely hidden from the public. The two men circled each other like planets locked in mutual orbit, neither able to escape the gravitational pull of comparison and competition. But what exactly transformed this professional rivalry into the personal hatred that would define their relationship? What was the match that lit this particular Hollywood fire? Stay with me, because the real story is even more dramatic than the movies these two legends made together. But beneath Lancaster's commanding presence and that million-dollar smile lurked a smoldering resentment aimed at one man alone: Kirk Douglas. Incident number 1, The Stolen Glory. 1948, Paramount Studios. Two rising stars were on parallel trajectories, but one believed the other was stealing his thunder. Burt Lancaster had just established himself as Hollywood's newest sensation when Kirk Douglas emerged with Champion in 1949, earning the kind of critical acclaim Lancaster reportedly felt should have been his alone. The similarities in their rapid rises were too close for comfort. "He's copying my playbook," Lancaster allegedly fumed to director Robert Siodmak. "From nowhere to leading man, that's my story." Pride births rivals, but insecurity feeds hatred, and this was only the opening round of a bout that would last decades. But what happened next would turn professional rivalry into personal animosity. Incident number 2. The first collaboration. 1957, set of Gunfight at the OK Corral. The tension between the two stars had reached a boiling point during the third week of shooting. Lancaster, always meticulously prepared, reportedly grew increasingly frustrated with Douglas's more spontaneous approach to scenes. Director John Sturges found himself mediating between two alpha males, each convinced his method was superior. When Douglas allegedly changed a key piece of blocking without warning, Lancaster erupted. "If you want to direct this picture, just say so," Lancaster reportedly snapped loud enough for the entire crew to hear. "Otherwise, stick to the damn script like a professional." What the public never realized was how close these two came to physical blows that day. A grip later claimed they had to be physically separated. But if you thought that confrontation was explosive, what happened during their next film together would shock even seasoned Hollywood veterans. Incident number 3. The Oscar Slight. 1960, the Academy Awards. Lancaster won Best Actor for Elmer Gantry, while Douglas, nominated for Spartacus, went home empty-handed. At the governor's ball following the ceremony, the two actors encountered each other near the champagne fountain. Witnesses reported that Douglas congratulated Lancaster, but added a barb that would fester for years. "Enjoy it, Burt," Douglas allegedly whispered. "You won for playing a con man. Hardly a stretch for you, is it?" Lancaster reportedly maintained his composure in public, but later that night allegedly told his driver, "Douglas will never understand the difference between being a star and being an actor." Some wounds heal with time, others deepen, and what Douglas did next would ensure this particular wound would never close. Incident number 4. The Production Betrayal. 1963, Hecht Hill Lancaster Productions offices. Lancaster discovered that a project he had been developing had secretly been acquired by Douglas's own production company. The property was 7 Days in May, a political thriller that Lancaster had been passionate about producing. When he learned that Douglas had not only secured the rights but cast himself in a role Lancaster allegedly coveted, the betrayal cut deep. "He doesn't just want his own success," Lancaster reportedly told a producer. "He wants to build it on the ruins of mine." Ironically, both men would eventually star in the film together, their off-screen animosity lending an electric charge to their confrontational scenes. But by then, any pretense of professional courtesy had evaporated. The next encounter would prove just how personal this feud had become. Incident number 5. The public humiliation. 1970. The Dick Cavett Show. In an era before media training, late-night talk shows could be unpredictable affairs. Lancaster appeared as a guest one evening, seemingly unaware that Douglas had been on the same show just the week before. When Cavett innocently mentioned Douglas's recent appearance and a charming anecdote he'd shared about Lancaster, the temperature in the studio reportedly dropped several degrees. "Kirk has always had a tenuous relationship with the truth," Lancaster allegedly replied with a tight smile. "Almost as tenuous as his relationship with acting technique?" The audience laughed, but industry insiders recognized the unmistakable venom behind the quip. Even Cavett appeared momentarily stunned by the undisguised hostility. The clip would be discussed in Hollywood circles for months afterward, but what most people don't know is that Douglas's response behind the scenes was even more dramatic. They nearly called a truce after this incident. Nearly. Douglas reportedly reached out through an intermediary, suggesting the two veterans bury the hatchet. Lancaster's response? He allegedly told the messenger, "Tell Kirk I'd be happy to bury the hatchet," right between his shoulder blades. But perhaps the most revealing chapter in this Hollywood feud came years later, when both men were facing the twilight of their storied careers. Who was Kirk Douglas? To understand why Lancaster's hatred ran so deep, we need to briefly examine the man who provoked such intense emotions. Kirk Douglas was born Isur Danielovich on December 9, 1916, in Amsterdam, New York. The son of Jewish immigrants from what is now Belarus, Douglas grew up in poverty but transformed himself through sheer determination. After serving in the Navy during World War II, he pursued acting with a singular focus that matched Lancaster's own intensity. With his distinctive cleft chin and explosive acting style, Douglas quickly established himself as a major star with films like Champion in 1949 and Ace in the Hole in 1951. Like Lancaster, he formed his own production company, Bryna Productions, named after his mother. Douglas was known for his intense preparation, fiery on-set demeanor, and willingness to take creative risks. He famously helped end the Hollywood blacklist by insisting that blacklisted writer Dalton Trumbo receive proper credit for Spartacus in 1960. A devoted family man despite well-documented infidelities, Douglas raised 4 sons, including future star Michael Douglas. His resilience was legendary. He survived a helicopter crash in 1991 and a severe stroke in 1996, yet continued making public appearances well into his hundreds before passing away in 2020 at age 103. In many ways, Douglas was Lancaster's mirror image, equally talented, equally driven, equally complex. Perhaps that's why they clashed so spectacularly. As the 1980s dawned, both Lancaster and Douglas were transitioning into elder statesmen of Hollywood. Yet even as their commercial viability waned, their mutual antipathy reportedly remained intact. In 1986, Lancaster suffered a serious heart attack, followed by a stroke in 1990 that severely limited his mobility and speech. During this difficult period, industry insiders waited to see if Douglas would reach out with a gesture of reconciliation. According to those close to both men, no such gesture ever came, or if it did, Lancaster rejected it. When Lancaster passed away in 1994, Douglas was notably absent from his funeral. In a brief statement to the press, Douglas reportedly said only, "Burt was one of the greats. We had our differences, but I always respected his talent." The understated comment spoke volumes about the complexity of their relationship. What can we learn from this decades-long feud between two of Hollywood's greatest stars? Perhaps that even extraordinary talent and success don't shield men from ordinary human frailties, jealousy, insecurity, pride. Or maybe that the very qualities that drive people to greatness, ambition, perfectionism, competitiveness, can also isolate them from potential allies and friends. In an industry built on illusion, Lancaster and Douglas created one of the most authentic dramas Hollywood has ever witnessed, a real-life rivalry that outshone many of their on-screen performances. So who was right in this legendary Hollywood feud? Was Lancaster justified in his resentment of a man he saw as copying his path to stardom? Or was Douglas simply another self-made success story whose similar trajectory triggered Lancaster's insecurities? Comment below with your take. Was Lancaster's hatred rooted in legitimate grievances, or was it the product of his own pride? And should Douglas have done more to mend fences with his ailing rival in later years? Make sure you're subscribed for our next video, where we'll explore another shocking Hollywood rivalry that changed the course of cinema history. Here's a hint. It involves two leading ladies and a slap that wasn't in the script.